This episode is in partnership with British luxury yacht manufacturer Princess Yachts. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new Motorsport podcast series. I'm Ed Foster, and this time we're turning our attention to Porsche. The series is called Porsche's Winning Formula. Ever since Ferdinand Porsche designed the Volkswagen Beetle in 1939, 8 years after launching his eponymous company in 1931, Porsche has been at the forefront of vehicle design. While the Pretty 356 was the first car to carry the Porsche name in the late 1950s, many of you will automatically think of the 911 that arrived over 10 years later. Arguably the most successful sports car of all time. The model is still being built nearly 60 years later. In those years, Porsche has won the Le Mans 24 Hours more than any other manufacturer. It's been victorious in Formula One, both as a constructor and an engine supplier, and it's won countless GT championships with its beloved 911. Porsches have even done rallycross and rallying. In this special podcast series, we are going to speak to the racers that are at the forefront of the German manufacturer's racing development and key names from the road car side to get a better idea of how this great company has had so much success for so long. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Motorsport podcast in the series of Porsche's Winning Formula. I'm joined by Tim Schenken. Thank you so much for joining us, Tim, all the way from Australia. It's 8 p.m. with you, 9 a.m. with us. It's great to see you. I can't believe we haven't done a Motorsport podcast with you.
Yeah, I think the closest I've done well, it wasn't a podcast, but the closest I've got to Motorsport, apart from when I was racing, or in more recent years, was a lunch with Simon Taylor.
Yeah, with that wonderful series he did.
Yes.
For years and years. I think I once worked out how many words he had written, because I think he had lunch with over 100 people. And in the office on a particularly boring day after deadline, I think we worked out roughly how many calories he had taken in over his lunch with series. And it's a miracle he's as light and slim as he is. But Tim, obviously this podcast is in the series of Porsche's Winning Formula, but you raced for so many people and raced in so many cars that we've got so much to talk about. What I wanted to do was just ask a bit about what you're doing now, because you're still working for the Australian Motorsport branch. Are you still the director of racing operations?
Yeah, that's my title. I'm sort of easing back a little bit now. So my main role is with the Australian Grand Prix. I'm the clerk of the course of the Australian Grand Prix. In fact, I've been a clerk of course at the Australian Grand Prix since 1985. I think was our first race in Adelaide, our first Formula One race. And I'm chairman of the organising committee, and I'm also race director for the Supercar series. And in addition to that, I do a fair bit of work with the FIA. I've been on the FIA Circuit Commission for some years. I do a lot of track inspections for it.
And I mean, this is a position you've held now for, it's over 3 decades, isn't it?
Yeah, I came back to Australia. I left Australia when I was 22. I came back when I was 42. So I came back in 1984. And I've been with Motorsport Australia since then. Originally, it was the Confederation of Australian Motorsport, recently changed its name. So we're the FIA affiliate in Australia.
Right. And what are you very positive about sort of future of Australian motorsport, especially on the driver side? Because, we've obviously, most famously, there's Daniel Ricciardo in Formula One at the moment. But I think, I might get this stat wrong, but I think you're one of only 5 Australian drivers to finish on a Formula One podium. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. And what does the future look like for Australian motorsport?
Well, first of all, I mean, our main national series is the Supercar Championship. And like England, it's the British Touring Car Championship, and Germany, it's the DTM. So that's by far the most popular and most well-supported championship we have here. And of course, we've got the youngsters coming up through open wheelers, but they really need, I mean, if anyone was to ask me today, the path to Formula One, it's to go to Europe and go karting. And you need to go there when you're young. and obviously follow then that FIA ladder, which is Formula 3, Formula 2, Formula 1, which strangely enough, in my day, that was the way you got into Formula 1, much the same. It lost its way for a while, but Jean Todt brought that step back in, that ladder back in, and that seemed to work very well.
There's a question here that I was going to come to a bit later, but it's from someone called Michael Dover. He wants to get into motor racing as a driver, and he's saying this is very, very difficult. Do you think it was easier, back in the 60s and the 70s to get to the pinnacle of sport?
No, I don't think it's any different. I mean, in the 60s and 70s, there was nowhere near the media coverage that you've got today. So any opportunity to find any money was almost zero. If you're looking for any sort of sponsorship, some drivers had some private money, but I don't think it's any different. I don't think it's any different. And now, of course, motorsport or motor racing is so well covered by the media that you've got a much better chance of finding the support to move up through the ranks.
Now, I mentioned before that the podcast is part of this series of Porsche's winning formula. Your kind of Porsche career, I suppose, really was compressed into a sort of a 3-year period between 74 and 77. Is that about right? And then one race in 78, I think.
I stopped in 77.
Yeah. Okay. So it was quite a compressed sort of Porsche career, as it were. But how did you first get involved in because you did the German DRM in 74, and that was in the RSR.
That's right. Yes, I was doing Formula 1 with Trojan. The car wasn't right, and that was my last shot at Formula 1. I could see I wasn't going to get back in there. So I think it was actually John Fitzpatrick introduced me to a very wealthy German fella. His name was Georg Loos, Georg, Loos, Loos, who'd made an absolute fortune in property development. And he had his cars prepared by racing service Porsche. So he only employed a truck driver, and everything else was done at the factory, which was interesting. The development there wasn't a lot of development at the factory, so it was people like Kramer and the likes. Of course, they were private teams and they could do as much development as they liked. But no, it was quite a good time, quite a successful time.
And what was your relationship with Le Mans like? Because you did race at Le Mans, a number of times, most notably in Porsches. Some people love it, some people don't really like it. What did you think of the race?
Well, I raced there. I think I first raced there in 1970 with Matra.
Yeah, in the Matra, yeah.
Yeah. You're going to have to keep me honest here with the years and the cars.
Right, I'll do. You're asking the wrong guy, but it's right. You can get away with murder on this.
So I'm not sure how many Le Mans I did. Maybe 6, maybe 7. But I did a. So it was Matra, and the car was out in the first hour. And then in 73, I was there with Ferrari with Carlos Reutemann and the 312 PB. And we got through, I think we were leading around 2:30 in the morning, and the engine broke. And then I was back again there with Loos, the Carrera, the 934, I think, of the 935. But I never managed to finish.
I think, was it in 76 you finished second in class with a 934?
I don't recall. Are you sure?
I think so. Well, this is off my sort of research over the last few days. I might well have got it wrong. So, well, anyway, let's. But it was quite a sort of it's a strange race, isn't it? Because it's not so much you having to win it; it's you having to survive it, as your results show. It must be quite a frustrating race to take part in.
Well, it was interesting because in my time you couldn't drive the cars flat out for 24 hours. I think it's different today. You can drive on the limit for pretty much the whole race. Certainly the first part of the race. So driving, I think in 73, when I was with Reutemann, we were driving something like 5 seconds or 6 seconds off the ultimate speed of the car. And that actually is quite hard to drive at that speed. When you're racing open wheelers and you're used to driving, right on the edge, to driving 5 or 6 seconds a lap slow or off the pace, it was quite hard, but you sort of get into the swing of it. And of course, in those days, we had Mulsanne Straight was straight. There were no chicanes. And that little Ferrari was probably 320, 200 miles an hour car. And it was quite funny because in the signalling pits was not where the regular pits were. It was at the end of Mulsanne Straight, just around the corner, around Mulsanne Corner. So I could swear to you, every lap, as I went around Mulsanne Corner and I looked across to the right to see what the pit board was, the mechanic was just coming out with the board and I missed it every lap. The only way I knew how I was progressing, how we were progressing, was Goodyear had a blimp. They had an airship, and they had a big screen on the big panel on the side, and it shows the positions of the cars. So as you were going down Mulsanne Straight, you could look up and see where you were running. And for fuel stops, it had a reserve tank. So when the engine coughed, you went past the pits once, and then you came in on the next lap.
Yeah, it's so different nowadays, isn't it? When you hear in all forms of motorsport, especially top-level motorsport, the engineers on the pit wall are feeding every single bit of information to the drivers, and vice versa with all the sensors. And I know obviously you were driving 5, 6 seconds off the pace. I suppose they do in Formula One races now, with the fuel and the tyres sometimes at the start. But do you think it was a purer form of motorsport as a driver because you didn't have all this information? It was down to you?
Oh, it was a different form. I wouldn't say it was a purer form. I mean, the information you had in the car was the rev counter, the oil pressure, the oil temperature, and the water temperature. It was just a different way of racing, and you can never go back. You're always going forward. And what we say today, people say today to me, "Oh, it's look at motor racing today. It's how can it be like this? It's uninteresting." And I said, well, just wait 25 years' time. You'll be looking back to today, and it's the heyday.
Yeah, it's very true. Yeah.
So the purest form of racing is Formula One. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. During this period in the 70s, when you're doing German DRM, the European GT Championship, the Le Mans in the 911s, you also raced Jaguars, you raced Fords, BMWs. How do they all compare? And where was kind of Porsche in that pecking order?
Well, first of all, you're going to have to remind me here. I was driving the Porsche. That's right, 93, the Carrera, then the 934, 935. I also had a run for a while in that European equivalent of the Can-Am series. It was called the Inter series. So I was driving a 917-10, which George Luce owned. But I wasn't racing BMW, nor.
So did you not do a one-off race in a 2002 BMW or a Jaguar XJ12? I'm going to find the person who gave me this information and give him a clip round the ear.
the Jaguar I drove in 1977. I did the European Touring Car Championship. Leyland owned Jaguar, the brand at the time. And we had that XJ12 5.3C. So this was a very powerful car. And it was a strange time for touring car regulations because the FIA regulations allowed you to make quite major modifications to the engine, but very restricted with the transmission and the brakes. So our cars were very fast, much than the competition was the 635 BMW. We were much quicker, much more powerful car, but the brakes, we had no brakes at all. It was like a train just slowing for a train into a station that just sort of slowed up. So having overtaken on the faster circuits the BMWs, and they were just a little spot in the rear view mirror as you arrived at the corner, having to brake so early. Of course, they were alongside you and overtook you. Next straight, you were past them. But I don't think I drove with John Fitzpatrick, and we never really finished a race. Or we might have finished one or two, but the cars are unreliable. It needed really a big injection of funding for the following year, and it would have been a championship winner.
Yeah. And but by this time, Porsche is really at the forefront of sports car racing. Because we've been speaking to Brian Redmond for the same series, and his Porsche career obviously started kind of 5-10 years before, when actually Porsche, yes, it was successful in sports cars, but the 917 hadn't arrived, and really Porsche's success, especially at Le Mans, was yet to come. By this stage, I guess you could tell that Porsche was one of the manufacturers to drive for, and it was one of the cars to have. I mean, you mentioned the XJ12 with a complete lack of brakes, but forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think the Porsches were obviously pretty sorted.
Yes, yeah, very much so. And I mean, Porsches always were virtually from the time they started racing. They got involved in motor racing. Porsches were always a class winner. And remember, the cars I were driving were not necessarily outright cars; they were class cars.
Yeah. And tell me about the 91710, because it's one of my all-time favorite cars, because it's 1,000 brake horsepower or something, and it's just what an absolute monster. But to people I speak to say, well, actually, it was really nice to drive, which in my amateur head is a very hard thing to compute. Something with that much power and sort of that little grip.
Well, it was actually quite easy to drive. Before the first race, I was thinking, oh my God, 1,000 brake horsepower. In fact, they had different tune of engines, and the way they did that were by the size of the turbocharger. So if you're on a short, twisty track, you had a small turbocharger on because it'd spin up quicker, so it was more drivable. And if you went to a place like Hockenheim, in my days, there were no chicanes at Hockenheim. You just went out of the stadium, down to the east curve, fast right and back again to the stadium. Then you had the bigger turbocharger on, put up with the lag, but the power was there, as you say, over 1,000 brake horsepower. But I was a bit, I wondered myself, to be honest, at first. But when I got in the car and drove it, it was remarkably easy to drive. It had, for those days, tremendous download, so it had huge grip, had huge tyres, excellent brakes. You just didn't want to hit anything in it because, of course, it just had a tube frame.
Yeah, I mean, it's astonishing, isn't it? But I suppose that was kind of Porsche's calling card, wasn't it? Especially going on into the later 70s and into the 80s, was, these cars, the 956, the 962, they were actually very drivable cars because, they were run by customer teams, and they weren't easy to win in, but they were easy to go quickly in and finish a 24-hour race.
And, Porsche used that development center in Weissach, and even their race cars, they would give them a hell of a hammering at Weissach on roads, virtually like normal roads, which were much more severe conditions than racetracks. So you never had to worry about them braking.
Yeah. Now, going from the 91710, I wanted to rewind all the way back to when you were still in Australia, and having made a go-kart out of, I think, a bed frame, you then made your motorsport start, or certainly your first race start, in, of all things, a Simca.
That's right. My mother had a Simca Aronde, which I think had a 1.2 litre engine. I can't remember. But and I was already very much into motor racing, and I was a member of the local car club, the Mini 850 Car Club, and I said to my mother that I was going to a barbecue somewhere, and instead of that, I went off out to Calder because the car club had a club meeting there, and in the morning there were quarter-mile sprints, just on the straight, of course, and in the afternoon they had circuit racing. Well, I didn't have a competition license then, but in the drag, in the sprints, you didn't have to have you just had to have a road license. So I competed in that in the morning, and then I stayed around at lunchtime just to watch some friends racing. And I noticed when the cars were lining to go out of practice, no one was really checking the cars. And I still had the number on the rear window. You know, you put it on with some white boot polish. So I thought I'll just go and line up with these cars and see what happens. And I lined up and they waved me out onto the track. So I thrashed around there and I thought, well, that's all pretty good. And then afterwards, I was looking at the grid sheets and lo and behold, my name was on there. So when my race came up, I lined up there in the race and I did a couple of races. So in fact, in the background there somewhere, there's a cup. I found it not so long ago, which I won in that race. So don't go telling John Todd that I did my first race without a competition license. Otherwise,
I was going to say it must sit particularly well with your current sort of official hat on. But you started work for a BMC dealership in Melbourne, I think, and
yes,
as on the sort of clerical side, and that was when you started consuming the British motorsport publications, whether that was Motorsport or Autosport. Was that purely out of a love for motor racing and an interest, or even at that time did you think, oh, I want a career in this? This is what I want to do?
Well, I was introduced to motor racing through a school friend of mine. I went to a grammar school here in Melbourne, and one of the boys in the class, his father had a little hill climb car, and I went around to have a look at that one afternoon. And when I saw it, a light bulb went on, and from that point onwards, all I wanted to do was to go motor racing. So I left school early. I was a hopeless student. All I could dream about was motor racing. I was working in the city of Melbourne, and there was only a block or so away was a big news agent called the Technical Book Company, and they had Autosport, Motoring News, Motorsport, of course, Motor Racing, and I would go there virtually every lunchtime to see if there was a new magazine in. And I would read them cover to cover. And I had realised very quickly that if I wanted to be a professional driver, I had to go to Europe. So I was quite clued up. By the time I went to Europe in 1966, I sort of knew all about motor racing in England and in Europe.
Was that, I mean, I know obviously you realised you needed to do that, but that must have been an enormous decision to make. Because, you know, you had I think you also raced a Lotus 18 in Australia, and you know, you were doing, and you won the Australian Hillclimb Championship in that jet-powered machine. To move over the other side of the world at that age, were your parents telling you not to, or you know, anyone else, or was it just a single-minded, this is what I need to do?
I was very single-minded about it. My parents couldn't understand. There was no motorsport background at all, or driving background at all with my parents. And I guess I was just naive, and you know, that's what I was going to do. And I just set about it. And I got on a boat here in Melbourne, in Port Melbourne, and 5 weeks later I turned up in Southampton in the middle of winter. But you know, when you're really dedicated or absolutely focused on doing something, all the stuff around you doesn't matter. And when I arrived in London, I went to we called it Kangaroo Valley. It's Earl's Court, where all the Australians went, and I had a bed sitter there. And it wasn't long I was moved out. I got a job with the Checkered Flag in Chiswick, and I moved out maybe to Brentford, somewhere like that. And I was sharing a one-bedroom flat with 4 other guys. We just had 4 mattresses on the floor, but all of us were involved in motor racing, and the flat was only there as a means of sleeping and having breakfast. The rest of the time we're out working or working on race cars. And when I look back now, I think, oh my God. But you when you live for something, you don't notice all of that.
Yeah. Did you not go and see the editor of Autosport to get him to mention that the Australian hillclimb championship winner was there in the UK?
I did. I went to Praed Street in Paddington. Does that sound right? And
that sounds right.
I arrived there at their offices. I think Simon Taylor. I spoke to Simon Taylor. Paddy McNally was there because at the time Paddy McNally was he was called the European correspondent. He'd covered the Grand Prix. So I arrived there and I spoke about while I was there and while I was in England and what I'd done. And Paddy McNally turned around and said, we put a thing in the magazine only a couple of weeks ago for a young Austrian driver, and through that he's been able to secure a Formula 2 drive. Well, that was Jochen Rindt. So the following week, there was my photo in Autosport, and a short story. But I've been waiting for that phone call. No one ever rang to offer me a drive.
Now, before you came over to the UK, though, you had a very torrid time in Australia on the motorsport side with the death of two kind of racing friends. At that age, that must have been just tell me a bit about that, because it must have been a very difficult thing to go through. And then there was all the press coverage of having these two friends having died. You were then in the car, and is it going to be 3 fatal crashes in 3 weekends? That's a lot for a lad your age.
Yes, I guess looking back now, it was a bit of a nightmare, to be honest. But in some ways, such a terrible thing turned out positive, because without that happening, and it's not a nice thing to say, I would never have gone to Europe. I'm sure I would have been racing. I probably would have been racing in Australia. That was a pretty tragic time, but that was part of the sport. And my first Grand Prix was at Monza in 1970, and one of my heroes, Jochen Rindt, was killed there. But you have just a naive belief that it's not going to happen to you. If you thought you were going to get hurt, especially me, if I thought I was going to get hurt or killed, I wouldn't be doing it. So all the stuff goes on around you, but you just continue.
Interestingly, when we were chatting to Brian Redman, he said that before he raced at Spa, he'd be up all night worrying. And he mentioned that to, I can't remember who it was he mentioned it to. And they said, "You're a complete idiot. God, if I was up all night worrying whether I was going to survive, I wouldn't have done it. I just didn't think about it." So they thought Brian was particularly bad on that. But it's once you
just let me tell you, my introduction to Spa was 1968 on the old circuit in a Formula Ford car. So,
flat everywhere. You had to brake 3 times or something.
I think you only braked I think 3 times a lap. 3 times a lap. So that was my introduction to Spa. But when I went back later that year to drive a GT40, I was terrified, and the car wasn't particularly well set up. The front right height was too high, so as you went down the straight, it was sort of floating all over the road. And I was driving with a fellow Australian, a chap called John Rayburn. The race started. We were a very poor team. It was pouring with rain. We didn't have wets. We couldn't afford wets, so we had slick tyres. So the cars came around on the first lap. Jackie X leading, of course. He went down past the pits, up through Eau Rouge, and disappeared before the next car arrived. In fact, I stood there thinking, there must have been a huge accident, because what's happened to the rest of the field? Anyhow, the rest of the field came past, and then eventually John came past, And as he passed the pits, he put his hand up to wave. It aquaplaned and ended up in a ditch. So I was quite happy about that. You know, driving around Spa in the wet on slicks wasn't a good idea.
Oh. Sterling Moss famously always said, I think motor racing should have that element of danger, or at least an element of it. If you get it wrong, you get some. He didn't want people to die, but he wanted some form of penalty. And the analogy he always used was anyone can walk across a tightrope a foot off the ground, but very few people can walk across a tightrope 100 foot off the ground. What are your thoughts on sort of modern motor racing and the runoffs, and what you guys had, ending up in a ditch or a tree?
Well, in the 70s when I was doing Formula One, we used to think we were quite well off because we had monocoque chassis, we had bag tanks, we had seat belts, we had bell crash helmets, we had an excuse for a roll cage. And when we look back at what it was like racing in the 50s and 60s, of course, they had nothing like that. So we were, in some ways, much better off.
Yeah. I wanted to talk a bit about your 68 season, where you started Formula Fords, and then by April, you had a Formula 3 contract because you were winning everything. And then you won not only the British Formula 4 Championship, but also the British Formula 3 Championship, which I think to this day is the only time that's ever been done. I know you learnt the British circuits obviously in Anglia, and then Lotus 22, I think. But
yes,
what was it that made everything click in that 68 season? Because you were nigh on unbeatable.
Well, I had the right car and I had the right engine, and it's like motorsport is today. It has to, if it's all going for you, it's all going for you. And as you say, I'd learnt the circuits with that only a couple of races in that Ford Anglia, but with the Lotus 22, and also I had all the gear ratios for the Formula 3 gear ratios for the British circuits, and I was able to calculate the difference and convert it to Formula Ford, because obviously a much lower revving engine, but same heel and gearbox. So I just started off on the right foot, and it just happened. I mean, the amount of motor racing you could do was incredible. In 1968, I did 68 races in the year, and I think I won 48 of them. 32 were Formula Ford wins. But the race meetings then were on the one day, so you could race at Silverstone on Saturday and go to Snetterton and race at Snetterton on the Sunday. And you often had heats and finals, so the amount of mileage one could do was incredible. Yeah.
And you mentioned the gear ratios there. Wasn't there a particular trick you had for Brands Hatch for qualifying and then the race?
Yeah, that was in Formula 3. I think a few of the top drivers would do this. So for practice, you'd put your first gear you used it Druid's hairpin. So you effectively then, once you got out of the pits, you got running, you really had a five-speed gearbox, because the first gear, you wouldn't use, but you used all the other four. But when it came to the race, of course, you couldn't start with that very high first gear. You had to go back to a normal, to the normal gear ratios. And surprisingly, it just fell into place. You didn't have to think about it. It just worked. So instead of going into Druids in first gear, you went in second gear.
Was that where you met Ronnie Peterson?
I met Ronnie. Yeah, and I met Ronnie, I think it was 68. And I have to say, gear ratios, then that was a big deal, the gear ratios, especially with a Formula 3 car, because with 1,000cc, high revving, no torque. So the gear ratios were quite critical. And normally, if you were, say, at Silverstone and someone asked you for the gear ratios, you'd give them the gear ratios for Monaco. Or if you're in Monaco and they asked you for the gear ratios, you'd give the gear ratios for Silverstone. But I don't know what it was about Ronnie. He came and chatted to me and asked, could I help, and asked for the gear ratios, and I gave him the gear ratios. And we sort of got on from then, where he was a lifelong friend. Short life for him, but we got on well together. And our wives and, well, they were girlfriends then and got on well. So it was unusual for me because really I didn't make any friends in racing. Everyone to me was the enemy. You were trying to beat them. So how could you be friends with them? Especially your teammate, because there you had somebody in the same car as you. So you had to beat him. That was your first aim was to beat your teammate. The second aim was to win the race. But with Ronnie, we just clicked.
What was he like as a driver? Because, you know, for someone my age, the photos you see of him as sort of opposite lock, and you hear stories of him complaining about understeer, and then a mechanic going down to the corner where he's complaining about understeer and seeing him coming in on oversteering. And they had to tell him, "Oh no, Ronnie, that's oversteer." And then I'm making it oversteer to get rid of the understeer. Was he as naturally talented as everyone says?
Yes, he was just gifted. He was just gifted, and it was interesting when I started driving for Ferrari. We drove together for Ferrari in together in 1972, and one of the early races I did, he would go out and practice and do quite an exceptional time. I'd get in the car and it wasn't balanced at all. It was all over the place. So I'd get the car working the way I liked it. And then he would get in and I'd think, oh my God, he's going to go 5 seconds a lap quicker. Well, he never went any quicker. He'd just drive around the problems. And it worked well with us because I would sort the car out. So, to drive around the problems, you'd be very hard on the car, certainly on the tyres. So once the car was right, he could lap very quickly, but much easier on the car.
Where did your sort of engineering side come from? Because, obviously you were very clued up on the gear ratios, on car setup, whereas the likes of Ronnie, that was almost alien to them because they just drove around problems. Where did that engineering side come from?
Well, the importance of setting up the car properly in the workshop before you even leave to go to the circuit. I sort of learnt that through Chaz Beattie. Chaz Beattie was team manager. He was a designer who worked for the Checkered Flag. And he had said to me that if you get the car properly set up in the workshop and you get to the circuit, if you've got any problems, you're not chasing a setup issue. So I always made it, I prepared my own car, certainly Formula Ford cars. And in those days, for example, with Formula Ford, you had steel wheels and they were never straight. So I made up a set of setup wheels, though there's always a slight buckle in them. So when you're trying to do the camber, you've got to be careful where the wheel is. So I made up a set of setup wheels. So the diameter was identical for the four wheels. And they ran straight. So when I set the car up in the workshop, it was absolutely spot on. But when you got to the racetrack, if you had a bit of a handling issue, it was more about adjusting shock absorbers, perhaps ride height, or anti-roll bars.
Now, we must just take a moment to thank our podcast partner, Princess Yachts. Princess Yachts has been a long-time supporter of Motorsport Magazine, and we are absolutely delighted that they are partnering this podcast series on Porsche. Much like the one with the green cover, Princess Yachts epitomizes the best of British manufacturing, and this company does amazing things on a daily basis. You must go and have a look at their website, princessyachts.com.
Now, something I really want to talk to you about is the 84-hour marathon at the Nurburgring. So you did that in a Cologne Capri, and it's just, I know there's obviously the 24-hour race at the Nurburgring, which I've been to actually, and it's one of sort of the maddest, most wonderful races I've ever been to. But an 84-hour marathon at the Nurburgring, tell me about it, because there were lots of quite strict rules about how long you could be in the pits, what you could do out in the circuit, how long the lap time could be.
Well, first of all, I think there was a rally called Liège-Sofia-Liège, and there'd been some fatalities, and so they changed the whole concept of the rally. So it actually started in Liège, but the cars then drove on the road to the Nurburgring. So they were obviously modified series production cars. And I'd been approached by Jochen Neerpasch, who was then the motorsport manager for Germany to do this race. So, and it was on the North and South circuit. So one lap was 29 kilometers. I think on the North circuit it's 22. So it was 29 kilometers. And I was driving with Dieter Glemser and a Frenchman. His name, I can't remember his first name, but it was P-I-O-T. And it was 84 hours, so long as you say, but it did have some strange rules. And one of them, exactly as you pointed out, was the pit stop, because for every minute you were stopped in the pits, you were deducted one lap, which was 30 kilometers. And the rules being what they were at the time, you didn't have air guns and air jacks and all this sort of thing. We had a hydraulic jack, and you had to use the wheel brace that was on the car. So the race started. In good weather. It wasn't long, and it started to rain. So we'd worked out that you could stop in the pits. The mechanics could change one tire, and you could get out again in less than a minute. So you went out, you stopped. So you had 3 slicks and a wet on. You did a lap and stopped again. You had 2 slicks, 2 wets, stopped again until you were all on wets. And then it would dry out, so you'd have to go through the same thing again.
Is everyone doing that?
I can't remember. It just seemed silly. But I mean, we were. I think we got as far as 60 hours, and you'd have to look at the records. And I think the head gasket went, but we were well and truly in the lead by then, because teams they'd been losing 1 lap, 30 kilometres every time they stopped in the pits for over a minute. But it was also funny, the start of the race, because unlike a normal race where you pull up on the grid, you get the countdown and the national flag and you start, this race started the first time you cross the line. I think it probably started at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I don't remember. So the first time you crossed the line after 3 o'clock, that's when your race started. So a lot of people had worked out, well, when I say a lot of people, maybe 10 other drivers had worked out, you go out just before the hour, drive around carefully, and hopefully you would arrive at the start line just as the clock ticked over the hour, and you then started your laps. Well, I was a bit nervous and I went a bit quickly. So I don't know if you're familiar with Nurburgring, but when you come to the end of the straight, it goes under a Dunlop bridge, over a crest, into a little gully. Well, I arrived there and I was early. So I thought I'd just pull over on the side and wait. And when I pulled up on the side, there were about 6 or 8 other cars there. And you could see the clock on the tower as it was going up to 4 o'clock or whatever the hour was. The French were, of course, out having a pee on the side of the road, as they tend to do. And just as it came up to 1 minute to 4, everyone was in their cars, and magically it clicked to 4 o'clock, and we all drove through the final chicane and down across the line.
I mean, amazing race. You know, it's one of those ones I just it would have been quite incredible to watch. At that time, you were doing sort of F2 as well, but it was then you got your Grand Prix debut with Williams. We've got a question here from Gary, who's saying that obviously you raced for Williams right at the start. Were there any signs then that they would go on and achieve so much? Because I think in the 70s it was just Frank, wasn't it?
It was just Frank and a couple of mechanics. And I got that drive. When Piers Courage was killed, I just took a deep breath and went to see Frank. I knew Frank, to see if there was an opportunity for me, and which there was. But Frank, you could see in Frank a bit like Ron Dennis. You know, he was absolutely determined he was going to be successful, and I think Frank went through iterations of Frank Williams 1968 Limited and went broke in Frank Williams 1969 Limited. And in fact, in the end, in those early years, the sponsorship money he was getting for the following year, he had to spend in paying people for the previous year. So he was always absolutely right on the limit. In fact, some of the suppliers wouldn't take a check from him; they'd only take cash. That was the way they dealt with him. But as I say, he was absolutely single-minded about getting to the top, which of course he did.
Yeah. Was a big turning point Patrick Head coming on board?
Patrick, yes, but that was after my time with Frank. Patrick Head, I met when I was driving for Trojan. In fact, he might have had a short period with Brabhams, I'm not sure, but he was a draftsman really helping Ron Turenak with that Trojan in 1974. And obviously a bright guy, and he went on, and the record shows.
Yeah. And in 70, you were driving the year-old Brabham, the BT 33. I think, did you not get a mention by Jenks? Because you obviously got some good results that year. And I think Jenks did then specifically mention you as having driven a very good race in a year-old Brabham. That must have been, for someone who grew up on motorsport and reading Jenks's Continental Notes and his Grand Prix reports, that must have been quite a nice moment.
It was a very nice moment, and of course, Jenks was a hero. And in my bookcase behind there, I still have his wonderful story of winning the Mille Miglia alongside Sterling Moss. Well, Sterling won it, and Jenks beside him.
Well, you think you've got dive problems? If I move my screen up, those are all my motorsports. it's like a disease. It's a problem.
Well, mine are on the other side there. You can't see them. Most of mine are free. I wouldn't pay for a book. No, I'm joking. It was interesting because being an Australian, you'd think naturally my hero would have been Jack Brabham, but strangely enough, it was Sterling Moss, and that came about because I was reading all the English magazines in the 60s, early 60s, before I went to Europe. So Sterling Moss, of course, was the man. So I always thought he was something special, and I was very lucky. I went some years ago. My wife Brigitte and I went and stayed, had a couple of nights with Sterling and Susie in London and at his house in London, and that was just so special. He is an incredible man, incredible. Now, you know what was lovely about him? He could easily have been saying, "Oh, it wasn't the same in my day." There might have been a little bit of that, but he always respected what the current rules were, the current cars were, and the current drivers were.
Yeah. Well, what I found amazing about Sterling was how even up right to the end, he was still flying all over the world, going to watch motor racing, and he was genuinely interested in the cars, and he did those pieces with Lewis Hamilton with the Mercedes cars and sort of swapping cars. And I think he was genuinely interested in how the modern Formula One car worked. And he used to say, movement is tranquility. But he never stopped. Incredible.
Yeah, he's one of a kind.
Yeah. Am I right in thinking that your move to Surtees, you've always sort of said was the beginning of the end for you in Formula One? Because it was a very difficult team to work for with John, because I think he was obviously in charge of the team, but he was very involved and quite imposing on the drivers, wasn't he?
He was a very difficult chap to drive for, and I think if you talk to any of those who raced for him, they all had they've all got their own stories and difficulties. The driver who was absolutely suited for Team Surtees was Mike Hailwood, because Mike just turned up, raced, and went off. So he never really got involved in the setup of the car or anything about the cars at all. And that was John's sort of driver. And I had some very strange experiences during the year, situations during the year. And one of them was at the British Grand Prix of Brands Hatch, where I had outqualified Mike. And I was proud as punch. I think I was fifth quickest, and Mike was no slouch, I tell you, when it came to cars, came to racing. And John said, "Oh no, that time's wrong." And I said, "Well, what do you mean it's wrong?" He said, "Yeah, it's wrong. It's wrong." He said, "Pat, it was his wife's name, Pat Surtees? Pat." He said, "She's the official timekeeper. She's got the correct times, and you weren't as fast as Mike. I'm going off to protest your time." Hey, what are you talking about? Yes, I'm going to protest your time. In the end, he didn't, but that was just an example. And I've met Don in recent years, just before we lost him. He was a great bloke, a really great bloke. For some reason, just paranoid running his race team. He thought everyone was out to get him.
Yeah. Do you think he had an easier relationship with Mike because they were both bikers? Do you think there was anything there?
I'm sure that helped. But the big thing with Mike, as I say, he just turned up, drove and left. And that suited John. He didn't want people fiddling with the car and asking difficult questions.
Yeah. Fast forward a little bit, and sort of around this time, you're driving the 312, the Ferrari sports car, and doing the Daytona 24 hours. You had quite an interesting night, the night before the 24-hour race with Ronnie, did you not?
You're ruining all my good stories. These are...
Well, I haven't said what happened yet.
What happened there was Ronnie and I were there at Daytona this was 72 for the 1,000-kilometre or 6-hour race. And we were staying, I was at the Speedway at the Holiday Inn, and we got a bit sick of the meals there. And I asked Mario Andretti, "Have you got, it's awfully boring eating there. Is there somewhere decent to eat in town?" He said, "Yes, whatever the hotel was, go down there. It's right on the beach. It's lovely, and you can look out across the beach and across the sea, the ocean." And so Ronnie and I went down there, and we were sitting there eating, and we noticed the odd car driving up and down the beach. And Ronnie said, "Oh, well, we should have a drive on the beach, along the beach, just for a bit of fun." "Oh, yeah, okay." Well, it was always me, Muggins. I was always the driver. So we zoomed. After dinner, we zoomed down the highway and turned onto the beach on one of these on ramps. It was something like out of a James Bond movie, and we took off. This thing took off, landed on the beach, huge slide, right in front of a police car. Well, the speed limit was 25. We probably arrived about 70, and of course the lights went on, and we were stopped immediately. We had no ID on us, no ID whatsoever. And of course, that's a big issue in the States. If you get stopped, the first thing you've got to show is your ID. We had no ID. So they took us back to the police station. They took us downstairs to where the cells were. We weren't put in a cell. And we sort of argued there for a while. And eventually I realized, well, Ronnie was only the passenger. Maybe he could go back to the hotel and get our passports. Yeah, there's a good idea. So Ronnie, by this time, was well and truly pissed off. It was late, and we had the race the following day. And so he went out, got into the car in the car park, and lit the tyres up and went off down the road back to the hotel. Well, of course, the police were immediately onto the radio, all points bulletin, roadblocks everywhere. And 20 minutes later, a very sheepish Ronnie came back. And they brought him back. And then I remembered in watching American movies, you're always allowed one phone call. So I rang Peter Shetty, woke him up, and I was already in the bad books for waking him up. Telling him what had happened was even in more serious trouble. And he said, "Oh, okay, I'll see what I can do." Well, I think he must have rung one of the France family, because maybe 45 minutes later, the phone rang in the police station. They answered, "Oh, yes, sir, yes, all right, yes. I'll just give them a caution this time," and hung up, and we were allowed to leave. So,
Amazing.
Yeah. Anyhow, yes, we were a bit embarrassed the following morning when we arrived at the circuit.
a bit sheepish. How did the race go?
I think we were doing quite well, and then we had a gearbox issue at the end. So I'm sure you got all the results there. I don't remember. I remember the races that we won, and those that we finished were usually second or third.
Yeah. What was that 312 like to drive? Because, you know, looking at the results in terms of the 917 versus the 312, the 917 really, it kind of always had that edge. But from what I hear, the 312 wasn't a horrible car to drive at all.
No, well, the formula changed from 5-litre engine capacity in the previous year to 3-litre. And so that's where Ferrari were using their slightly detuned Formula One engine, that 3-litre flat 12. Peter Shetty was the team manager. They had poached Emano Corgi, I think his name was, who was a Gung team mechanic, chief mechanic from Wire. And I don't know if this is sort of recorded anywhere, but each driver had 2 cars. So while you were racing one car, the other car was back at the factory being prepared for the following race. So you changing. You drove the same car every second race. So it was incredibly professional. They had the best cars. They had the best drivers. Me, of course, I've got to say that. But no, Hicks and Andretti and Redman and Ronnie, Regazzoni. And the opposition was, I think, the Golf Mirage, and what else? It would have been Alfa Romeo as well. So we had the best cars. Ferrari hadn't mastered building a monocoque, so they were tube frames. The 1972 car was short wheelbase, so they were a bit difficult to handle on fast corners, but on shorter circuits, tight corners, they were very good. It was great. And a lovely car to drive, Beautiful gearbox. We used to think the Hewland gearbox was a nice gearbox, but the Ferrari gearbox was so light and easy. It was a great, fantastic time, actually. When you're with Ferrari or an Italian team and you're winning, it's the best ever. The following year wasn't so hot because Matra came along. They understood aerodynamics. They had a monocoque chassis, and they just had a better car. So we struggled in '73.
Yeah. Just to sort of, I can't believe we've nearly come to an end already. But I wanted to finish on Porsches. You know, you drove so many, whether those were the GT cars, you know, the 934, and then onto the 935, and also the 91710. Do you have a particular favourite out of those when you look back at it?
Well, I always say my favourite cars are the cars I won in or did very well in. I mean, that 935 was a difficult car to drive because it probably had 750 brake horsepower. You know, it was 3.5 litre, I think, twin turbo, very powerful, engine out the back, great big wide rear tyres to handle the power, and skinny little front tyres and a lock diff. So they were very, very difficult to drive, especially in the wet, because when you arrived at a corner in the wet, they always wanted to go straight, and it took a bit to get it to turn. And then, of course, when you got the power on, it was then all oversteer. But I won the Nurburgring 1,000-kilometre race in it with John Fitzpatrick and Trine Hazelman, so I was happy.
Yeah. And you had wins really sort of all over the world, but were there any circuits? Because I keep bringing up Brian, but obviously we've talked to him, you know, about this, you know, in this series. He hated but loved Spa. You know, he didn't like racing at Spa, but he won the 1,000 kilometers 4 times. Did you have a circuit that you had particular sort of affinity with that you just naturally went quicker at?
No, once again, the circuits I did well on are the circuits I loved. I did actually enjoy Nurburgring, I must say. For some reason, Nurburgring just seemed to suit me. And I know they call it the Green Hell, but it wasn't the Green Hell as far as I was concerned. And other great circuits, and we've lost many of them now, was Brands Hatch Grand Prix circuit, the original layout. Alton Park was also the original layout there. They were fantastic circuits. Rouen in France, Albi. You know, they're circuits that I doubt would survive today, but they're all wonderful circuits to drive on. Fast, demanding, hard, tough.
Yeah. Well, Tim, I can't believe we're sort of out of time already. And there's so much we haven't talked about. But really, that's just a good excuse to maybe do another podcast soon. It's been an absolutely wonderful hour of chatting all things, whether it's Formula One or Porsche or Ferrari at Daytona or being arrested almost twice. It really has been great. And thank you so much for sparing so much time all the way from Australia.
All right, Ed, that's my pleasure. And I love talking about myself. So if you want to do this again, in another 50 years' time, I'd be happy to oblige.
Well, there's a glowing report for the Motorsport podcast. I must say thank you to all of you as well for listening and for watching. Do check out all the other podcasts we have in this series of Porsche's winning formula, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.